Thank you very much, Yong Nian. Thank you for sharing with us a very unique perspective. To summarize, Professor Zheng's argument is that there will be no war between China and the United States for cultural reasons. And he said that if you examine Chinese culture or the culture of Chinese historical thought, the Chinese mindset has always been defensive rather than offensive, that is inward looking. And he said that the Great Wall of China is a symbol, is an example of this Chinese mindset of defending China's territory from invasion by the barbarians, I guess. But of course, Yong Nian doesn't ask the question, what happens if China regards its core interests as being threatened by the United States? Then how would China react to that? Well, maybe the next two speakers will answer that. And it now gives me great pleasure to introduce Professor Terry Nardin, who's an American, but he's here as chairman of the Department of Political Science at NUS. Terry, please.
Okay, so our question for this evening is, will the U.S. live in peace with a rising China? I suppose one could put the question the other way around. Will China live in peace with a declining United States? Instead of thinking of China as a threat to peace, we should at least consider a shift of perspective and as a kind of experiment, think about the United States as posing a potential threat. Not that I think that it does, but once again, just as a kind of a thought experiment. This is not such a novel idea. Fears of American domination, hegemony, imperialism, intervention have arisen again and again in the course of the 20th century. The difference is that in the past, fears were premised on American power. Today, these fears are premised on American weakness. In a recent New York Times column, Columbia journalism professor Thomas Edsall asked whether the U.S. is facing the end of market democracy. He asked whether the American workforce, millions of people, is at a structural disadvantage in the face of technological advance and global competition, and whether this situation might be permanent. He asked whether the share of profits flowing to investors and high-earning CEOs would continue to grow while the wages of ordinary Americans stagnate. He asks whether the surging wealth and income of the top 1%, and never mind that, the top 1/10 of 1%, is reaching a tipping point where the political leverage of the very affluent decisively outweighs that of the electorate at large. So it's a kind of common observation, for example, that Newt Gingrich is only still in the race because he's got multimillionaire backers, not popular support. Is it possible that in the United States, democratic free market capitalism is no longer capable of providing benefits to a majority of workers? This weakening social fabric in America is a matter of great concern. At one time limited to the urban poor, it now affects the heartland majority. Some call this the Latin Americanization of the United States, which is a bit unfair considering how Latin America has flourished and democratized in recent years. A hollowed out middle class in the United States creates a nation of resentful people whose resentment it could be, I'm not saying it is, this is an imaginary scenario here, could be the resentment, could be the motor of hatred, xenophobia, and authoritarianism. And politicians who unfortunately are sometimes more likely to pander than to lead will have to follow. Solutions in the United States are elusive because of the decentralized structure of the United States. The United States Constitution disperses power. and as many have observed, it actually overrepresents the rural areas, the less populated areas of country at the expense of cities. One of the cliches of American politics is that it's divided up into red versus blue states, Republican versus Democratic states. If you look at a map of the United States by county level, you see that there are no red and blue states, really. There are red and blue counties, and the blue counties, the Democratic counties, are urban counties for the most part, and the red counties are rural counties for the most part. This situation has led commentators to identify what they call empty politics, which I think is on full display in the Republican primary presidential process now going on. Bloomberg columnist Clive Crook, in a column reprinted in the Straits Times a few days ago, said theorists of American decline are preoccupied with the surging growth of emerging rivals, especially China. This is an important issue, but there's a much bigger threat to American power, the abject failure of the country's own political class. And he pointed to some evidence of this. Public policy in hibernation during endless political seasons, inability to make long-term plans, a debased level of political debate, a kind of idiocracy rather than democracy. Weak national support for the Democrats is quite telling because it seems to reflect, you would think at this point the Democratic Party would have a lot more support than it does, and some part of this has to reflect I think, racist fear and hatred of a black president accused of not being an American, of being, horror of horrors, a Muslim, the other to a rather large, ignorant, and angry swath of the American population. Crook says, rather acerbically, I would say that China is the least of this country's problems. Well, perhaps it doesn't matter what question we ask, that is, whether we focus on China or the United States. Let's focus on the relationship between two great nations, because they are both great nations. Their relative power, their trajectories, and by implication, their cultures. These cultures are assumed to be very different, but that's a conclusion we need to defend, not simply assume. Both countries, in fact, are culturally, intellectually, and politically quite diverse, and some of the things that I'm going to talk about actually are more universal. I think they really cross across cultural gaps. One cause for concern, according to what political scientists sometimes call the democratic peace hypothesis, is that democracies are less likely to go to war with one another. This recycles a much older theory, which is that peace is more likely in a world of republics. Countries, the word republic in the 18th century meant a country that had a executive that was separate from the legislature, so that the people applying the law were not the same ones who were making it, and this was thought in Republican theory to provide a barrier against despotism. What this means is that people who have an understanding of the opposite of despotic politics, which is politics based on the rule of law, would be better able to coexist with other peoples on the basis of the rule of law. Philosophers like Immanuel Kant or John Rawls argue that peace is more likely when states become republican. Put differently, in an expanding community of non-despotic states, you would have greater possibilities of coexistence that's not only peaceful, but would be on the basis of mutual respect between countries. And all of these theorists kind of imagine two levels of international order. The first, a minimal order in which all kinds of regimes could participate. This is sort of like the United Nations today, where a great diversity of regimes is a member. And a more maximal order in which only non-despotic regimes participate, sort of like the European Union. And the despotic regimes, the rogue states, would remain outside. From this perspective, the question is, will China enter or remain outside the community of non-despotic states? Trends in China, you might think, are driving it in the direction of liberal democracy. I mean things like the growth of an affluent and increasingly educated middle class. But as we know, there are many obstacles, cultural, legal, and political, to liberalization in China. Even so, it would be a mistake to embrace any kind of cultural determinism. Asian values are not the only values in China. China does have a democratic tradition in Sun Yat-sen, the democracy movement in Hong Kong.